Plotting can be super overwhelming, and you might be the type of person that loses inspiration for the project once it's all planned out. Well, I'm here to show you how you can still make your book work structurally while not having to spend hours pre-planning your story.
Welcome to The Plottery, where I teach writers just like you how to make storytelling become second nature.
Hi guys, this is Shar. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be discussing how to go from pantsing to plotting. So unfortunately, writing is not quite as easy as just getting an idea, sitting down and putting that idea into your keyboard and on your laptop, and then, you know, a few weeks later you have an amazing polished book that's ready for publishing. No. It would be great if that was how it worked, if you could just have this idea and then it immediately comes to fruition and it has a perfect plot structure and very detailed and complex characters, and they just come out of you because you're that talented and you're such an amazing writer and you don't need to draft and you don't need to rewrite. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen to many or any people, I don't think. I think you could be in the writing business for years generally and still not quite be able to write a bestseller right off the bat. Some of you might be new to writing, you might be new to the writing world, you might not really know what pantsing is and what plotting is. So let me just break it down for you really quickly. Pantsers usually know what they want their story to be about, or they have a semblance of a concept or a semblance of a plot or a world or characters that they're putting into the story, but they generally just sit down and they start writing and they see where the writing itself takes them. And usually this is called also discovery writing, when you sit down and you just you have a vague idea, but you follow your track of mind and you just keep going until you finish the first draft, and then you actually get a sense of your story and what your story is. Some people might mistake pantsing for literally like sitting down and typing just because you got an idea without actually doing any planning beforehand. But again, I would say this is kind of a misconception. I mean, obviously every writer has a different approach to writing, but pantsing doesn't necessarily mean that you're just sitting down and writing without thinking. You are still thinking. You are still building characters, you're still building your world and everything like that, but you're just not necessarily staying to plot the structure of your story and write a chapter treatment and so on and so forth. Which brings me to plotting. You have plotters, and you're on the channel called The Plottery, so you can guess which one I am. But yeah, plotters are people who generally take time to plan out their stories before they actually jump straight into them. Now, I'm not actually a massive plotter. Like, I won't spend days and weeks and months of my life planning a concept out on the page and making outlines and breaking it down by chapters. I generally tend to move away from this really quickly. I don't like to stay stuck in the outlining process. So what I will do is come up with a very vague general outline of all of my plot beats, the most important ones, and then I'll go into writing. So it's good if you can kind of find a happy middle, and if you are comfortable in that middle, that is great, because that's probably the best place to be in as an author. But obviously some writers prefer a more strict, a more rigid approach to writing your book, so they will go for plotting. And some writers are free spirits and they like to discover their characters as they go, and that's totally fine. It's a sort of a scale, so you can be a pantser, you can be a plotter, and then you place yourself somewhere on the scale. Right, let's get into the first topic that I wanted to discuss with you guys today, and this is the idea that over plotting can actually destroy your project. When you get into too much detail about your project, about what you want your world to be, about exactly which plot beats you want to hit, exactly which chapters you want to hit them in, and what the flow of your story is going to look like, what your characters are going to be doing in any given moment, how they're going to be reacting to every given thing in your project, this can kind of become overwhelming for a lot of writers and give them the sense of not actually having control over a project that they genuinely have full control over. You might feel like your project is slipping away from you. You might feel like everything is just happening and everything has already been planned out, and therefore there is no more fun to be had with the project. You don't actually know what else you could do because you've set such strict boundaries, and then you can't change anything, and you might end up feeling trapped in this project when really it's your project and you have full creative control over everything that happens, and you should keep that creative control for yourself and make sure that you're aware that you have it. And another thing that over planning can lead to is actually staying stuck in the planning process. This means that you literally don't move away from the outline stage. Like, you'll never actually get to write down that first chapter because you've just done yourself in, basically. So many people that I've spoken to who come to me as well to work with me as clients is they'll come and they'll say, oh my God, I've done like this massive, huge outline, but I have no idea how to start. Like, how do I actually begin the project? How do I actually start writing it? And so this is another plus to pantsing, coming from a plotter, that you just get into your writing as soon as you possibly can, as soon as it is comfortable for you to do so. Generally, what I will do as a fiction writing coach is I will get my clients working on their outline and thinking their story through, but I will also tell them to write that first chapter as soon as they possibly can. So usually within like 1 or 2 weeks of working with them, of actually trying to coin what this idea is that they have, I will immediately tell them, like, listen, you need to write that first chapter. Otherwise, the longer you stay in the outlining process, the bigger the risk is that you'll never leave it. Okay, so there are some things that you are going to need to set up before you start your story anyway, whether you are a pantser or a plotter or you're trying to shift your way in between that scale. It doesn't matter, you are still going to need to at least think about, if not write down some of these things before you start your project. Number 1, whose story are you actually telling? So who is that leading character of your story? Who is that hero that we are going to root for? Who are they? You need to know them. You need to know them inside and out. You need to know them as well as you possibly can. Of course, if you are trying to pants your way through it, if you are a discovery writer, it is totally fine to kind of leave a few things open to interpretation and just get into the writing and discover some of these things as you go along, because that is going to happen. That is going to happen to pantsers and plotters alike. There is no way that you can sit down to write and still have the same character at the end of your draft as you did when you started typing up that first chapter. It is never gonna happen. You are going to discover so many things about your characters when you actually start writing them. So you don't necessarily need to know every single detail about them, but the better you know them, the easier it is going to be to write them. This is why draft 2 can actually be a lot simpler to tackle, because you are, by the end of draft 1, going to know so much more, infinitely more about your character than you could have ever done without actually having written anything about them and just spent, I don't know, hours doing their character sheets or making their mood boards or fantasizing about what they might get up to. You are inevitably going to know more about them by the end of your first draft. The second thing that I would like you to think about before you start writing your story is, what sort of narrative perspectives are you going to use in this story? So are you going to write from first person? Are you going to write directly from that person's imagination? Are you going to write directly from what it is that they think, that they feel? Are you going to get really, really close to them? Or are you going to step away just a little bit and you're going to do like a third person focalized perspective, so that we are still there, still with the characters, but we just have a little bit of distance from them, so we're not quite in their head, but you're keeping some of that closeness in? Or are you going to go even further back and do a third person detached, so it reads a little bit more like a screenplay, so it's a little bit more objective and your readers get more space for interpretation rather than being fed all of this emotional turmoil? They kind of have to be positioned a little bit more as detectives, because they don't necessarily know exactly what's going through every character's head at any given point in time. Whatever you decide to do, make sure that you know why you're doing it. And again, if you are not pre-planning everything that happens in your story, you might find that once you have completed your first draft, you might realize that your narrative perspective should have been different, or you should have done something differently. And then you might go into your second draft and rewrite it from a completely different perspective. Maybe you might even rewrite it from a different person. Maybe you might introduce an extra narrator, and you can revisit that in the second draft. With the narrative perspectives, you definitely want to be asking the question of why. Like, why did I choose to tell my story from this person's perspective and not that one? Or why am I using the present tense and not the past tense? These are all questions that you should have answers to. You should know exactly why you chose that perspective and exactly why you're telling it in present tense or in past tense or whatever. There needs to be some kind of reason, some kind of purpose behind your choices, your active choices for narration. And again, for your first draft, you maybe don't have to stress about it that much. try and experiment with it. Allow yourself, maybe even, if you get to about halfway through your draft and you decide that you want to try out doing this from third person instead of first person, do it. Like, there's no one stopping you. You can play around with whatever it is that you want to play around with, and then make your decision when you do your second draft to see what feels better and what matters more for the story. The third thing that you should have to think about before you start your book is the world, the vibe, the other sort of characters that we might find in here, the sort of tropes that we might see in this particular world, in this particular genre that you chose. So for example, if you're writing a horror and you're setting it in a haunted house or something, then there's a certain set of tropes that come with this genre and with this particular setting. And there's a certain type of character that you could also expect, that your readers might expect to see in this book. So keep all of that in mind and think about what you want to actually keep from these established tropes and established genres, and what you might want to get rid of and sweep under the carpet. Number 4, probably one of the most important things to keep in mind before you start your story is, why are you telling it? You need to know why you're telling the story. What does the story mean to you? What question are you asking with the story? This is the key. This is probably the key to writing a story as a pantser, pantsing your way through it, and actually finishing that first draft. If you don't know why you're telling your story, and if you don't know the message or the story question that you're trying to answer, it's going to be a lot more difficult to actually get through that first draft, because you're not going to know why you're even getting through it. You're not going to know why you're writing it. And when times get tough, because they inevitably will, because if you don't have a structure and if you're just kind of shooting in the dark, then when you hit a wall, you're not going to have a reason to climb over that wall, because you just don't know why you're telling the story. Now we've come to the most sensitive part of the video, and this is plot. And I need you to actually keep your plot in mind before you dive into the story. I'm not saying that you need to know everything that happens, and I'm not saying that you need to build an outline or that you need to sit down and craft a chapter by chapter treatment. You don't need to do any of those things. But what you do need to do is at least have some general sense of where your story is taking you, or where your story might end. And I'm gonna tell you to try and think a little bit about the most important events of your story. So the most important beats of your story. If you can nail these down, generally, you don't need to nail them in detail, but if you can nail these 4 or 5, I'm not sure how many, we're gonna find out when I start listing them. But if you can nail these several plot beats down, you're gonna have a much easier time actually than writing your story, because you're gonna kind of know the final destination, and you're gonna know the stops along the way that you have to make. And then everything in between, you can kind of fill in the gaps with your creativity and your imagination. So these plot beats that I'm talking about, that you should definitely think about before you start, are your inciting incident. So the moment that sets your story in motion, the first moment where something happens that breaks your character out of their day-to-day life and sets them out on a mission. So that's the one point that you should definitely be aware of. Number 2 is your first plot point. So this is usually when your character actually actively makes the decision to do something. This is a very important one, and I see this overlooked a lot in a lot of outlines that come to me with clients, and they have a pretty decent outline that follows the basic 3-act structure. But for some reason, the first plot point is something that is often overlooked. So it's the moment where your character, your hero, your protagonist actually makes an active decision that they're going to follow whatever external goal presents itself to them. Okay, number 3. You are definitely going to want to think about your midpoint. And the reason I say this is because of the saggy middle. So I think everyone, at least once in their writing career, has experienced the syndrome of, I have no clue what to do in the middle of my story. I have the beginning and I know how I want it to end, but I have no idea what happens in the middle. So this is why you need to think about your midpoint before you start your story. The way the midpoint works, and I'm just gonna go over this briefly, the midpoint is basically the plot twist of your story. The midpoint is that big plot twist, bang on in the middle of your story, something happens, your hero learns something new, something they didn't know before, and then that changes either their external goal or the direction that they were heading in. and it kind of messes up all of their plans and messes up what they were working towards. So you definitely want to have a midpoint. Number 4, you want to have a think about what the worst moment in your book is going to be. So what is that worst thing that's ever going to happen to your hero? You want to at least have a little think about what that might look like. What might you take away from them in their worst moment that's going to really knock them down and really make them rethink their choices. And finally, number 5, you want to have at least a vague idea of how you want to end things. You want to know whether it's going to be a sad ending, whether it's going to be a happy ending, whether, you know, your hero's problems are going to get resolved, whether they're going to achieve whatever it is that they were hoping to achieve. You don't necessarily have to know all the details. You don't necessarily have to know how all of your plot lines wrap up, but have a general idea of where you want to take this, or have several ideas of where you want to take this. I know it's quite common for writers to have several different endings in mind as they start the story, and you know, you figure out whichever one you want to get to by the end, and that's totally okay. But just as long as you have those options there for you. Okay, one thing that I just want to stress, and this goes for both plotters and pantsers and all writers alike, is that your outline is gonna change. Like when you're writing your first draft especially, you should be treating your outline as a live document. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you're writing your first draft, inevitably you are still discovering what your story is about. You are still learning who your characters are, what things you might want to change, what things you might want to leave, what things you like about the story, what things you hate about the story, and your outline is going to change with it. So don't think of your outline as a Bible. Don't think of your outline as like this document that you have to follow or your story is going to fall apart. I promise you it's not. You can step away from your outline and you can still have an interesting plot twist that arises organically just because you'll let your character step away from that rigid structure for a second. So treat your outline as a living document and give it space to breathe and work on it while you are working on the first draft. Work on it alongside your first draft. All right, now I do want to give you some tricks for non-plotters. Try out the flashlight method. Now, if you haven't heard of this, this is an interesting method. It's pretty much discovery writing, but what you want to do is get quite familiar with the story structure and how story structure works and stuff, and then only outline one chapter at a time or a couple chapters at a time before you sit down to write them. So this way you are not necessarily ruining the rest of your story, right? Without allowing yourself some fun to discover things as you go along, and you're just kind of tackling one piece of writing at a time, one scene, one beat, one chapter, however works best for you, and you're only kind of shining the flashlight as far as you can see. Seeing as far as the flashlight shines. I'm not gonna get into the metaphor of it all, but you kind of understand the concept. I hoped. Writer here, metaphors, yep, great, it's all working out just fine. Not like this is my job or anything. Okay, the second trick that I really like and that I kind of briefly spoke about is having a living outline, a whole separate file of just messy notes, like ideas that come to you while you're writing that first draft. But don't stop to go over and edit them or change them or whatever. Just make sure that that file keeps getting updated with fresh ideas and fresh perspectives on how you are actually going to tackle writing your second draft. Because again, keep in mind, your first draft is literally just there to get your ideas out on the page and discover what your story is actually about. Because there is no better way of discovering your story than actually writing it. Tip number 3, be okay with messes and non-linear writing. So this is very common for pantsers. Non-linear writing, it means that you kind of jump from scene to scene as they come to you or as you visualize them or whatever. And you need to come to terms with that not feeling like an overwhelm for you. Obviously, this doesn't work for every writer and it might throw you off and it might make you uncomfortable, but sometimes it's actually okay to jump from, I don't know, writing your first chapter to writing like an all is lost moment or something like that. And the reason this is okay is because you can learn a lot from whatever it is that you write, like whatever scene that comes to you. If you just take some time to sit down and actually write the scene out, you might find out things that you wouldn't have otherwise known, and then you might write a stronger chapter too because of that knowledge that you now have about what's going to happen or something like that. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that when you write that scene, you don't get too attached to it, because likely by the second draft, or even by the first draft, by the time you actually get to connect that scene to other parts of your story, it might have to change, and it might have to change a lot, and you might even have to cut it. Tip number 4, get very, very familiar with story structures. And yes, I know this goes against the idea of pantsing, but the more you know about story structure, the easier it is to pants. Tip number 5, let your characters take over the story. If you already know what your character's internal conflict looks like and what their journey should be on a general sort of broad note, then it's okay to kind of let them take the reins to your story every once in a while and lead you in the direction that they want to go in. If you are a diehard pantser and you absolutely despise plotting, then you might enjoy my video on why plot doesn't matter, which you can watch right here. I hope this video has helped alleviate some of that pressure of having to outline. As I said, I am a plotter, but even I don't go into crazy detail, so you don't have to feel like plotting is something that's super overwhelming, or that it's super complex, or that like you need to be an absolute genius to do it. You don't. Sometimes it's okay to just kind of have your general idea, know your plot beats, and then just start writing. There is a power in starting to write your first draft, because believe you me, so many people get stuck in the outlining stage that they never make it to the paper. So don't be one of those. Go ahead with your project, write on, and I will see you on the flip side.